Hi everybody and welcome to Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans, True Aussie Murders Caffeinated. I am your host, Belinda Brady, and welcome guys, welcome to episode 12. And today's episode is titled I Just Hate 'Em, the Frankston Serial Killer. Now, straight up, I need to cite my sources, and the sources for today's episode are media.heraldsun.com.au, murderpedia.org, frankston.vic.gov.au and Expedia. And I'm going to do a real quick shout out to some awesome podcasts that I've come across in the past fortnight. And the first one is Chillers and Thrillers. Now, this is a super spooky podcast solely dedicated to real life ghost stories read by the fabulous host M. Now, my favourite episode so far is the one about hauntings in Australia, of course, and the one in Tasmania is really, really cool. So please, if ghost stories are your thing, get on and check it out. And for the motoring enthusiasts out there, I haven't forgotten you guys either, because Historic Hot Laps, hosted by the awesome Alex Daniels, is a fantastic podcast to listen to if you're into cars and racing, past, present and future. Alex takes a real deep dive into racing history and covers everything and anything, and it is really, really, really great podcast. So please jump on there, guys, and give these guys a support and listen. Okay, first up, what am I drinking? Now, I am drinking Pepsi Max. It is summer here in Australia and it is disgustingly hot and humid, and the thought of having coffee is making me break out in a sweat. So I'm sticking to Pepsi Max. I'm cooling myself down. I probably won't be able to sleep because I'm having too much caffeine in the form of Pepsi Max. But hey, it is what it is. Okay, and I also need to give a warning for this podcast. It does talk about murder. It does get quite graphic. And it does talk about a young girl under the age of 18 who was murdered. So if this is not your thing, that is fine. Please turn me off. And you can come back to me if you feel like you can. But if not, let's get stuck straight into it, guys, because this is a horrible case, but it happened. I actually remembered when it happened. I remembered when everything was going down, and you know, the fact that it's all these years later, it's still etched in my memory because, yeah, it's mind-blowing. So it is a horrible case. So without further ado, let's get stuck right into it. Episode 12, I Just Hate 'Em, the Frankston Serial Killer. Now, this episode takes us to a suburban town in Victoria, Australia. And yes, it's Victoria again. No hate, I promise. This is just where this crime lands, called Frankston, and the year is 1993. Now, in the dead of winter, in June 1993, 3 young women are brutally murdered. One on her way home from work, one a new mother who was ambushed in her car when she ducked out to the shops to get some milk, and a teenage girl set upon as she was walking home from school. 3 families had their lives changed forever, and 3 much-loved young women were dead, all in the space of 7 weeks. And as quickly as these brutal murders started, they finished, thanks to an observant eye, leaving police, suburbs and families shaken, and families asking, and people just asking, why? Now, the killer is serving 3 life sentences in jail. He'll never see outside of jail in his lifetime. And after tormenting his victims with possible parole, which was denied, just for a brief moment, he then decided he identified as the very thing he said he hated so much he just had to kill them. More on that later on. So get yourself comfy, guys, grab a drink, and if you are in the cold part of the world, send some of it our way. Not too much, but some. But grab yourself a comfy, blanket, rug up, get some hot chocolate and settle in and lend me your ears, guys, as we take a deep dive into the disturbing and fascinating case of the Frankston serial killer. So let's dive straight into this episode, and to do so, we have to start at the start of this killing spree, and that is with the first victim, Elizabeth Stevens. Now, Frankston, Victoria is your ordinary almost by the ocean suburb of Victoria, suburban Australia. In fact, if you Google the town, there are some stunning shots of Frankston Pier, and due to its proximity and stunning wine region, the suburb is often referred to as the gateway to the Mornington Peninsula. It is a stunning area. It's really, really pretty. But beneath this pretty exterior lays a gruesome story of an evil that started well before the first murder victim was found. But once she was found, it would soon bring her killer to light. Elizabeth Stevens was an 18-year-old girl who had moved to Victoria from Tasmania in January of 1993, and she had moved there to study in the armed forces. Now, Elizabeth was staying with her auntie and uncle in Langwarrin at the time of her death. On the Friday night, the 11th of June, 18-year-old Elizabeth Stevens was due home, as per usual, to the house she had shared with her auntie and uncle. Now, she always caught the bus home, and on this night, she had left a note that morning to say she was going to be studying at the local library, and she'd hoped to be home no later than 8 o'clock. When she didn't arrive home by 10:30 p.m. that night, her worried uncle drove around looking for her, not being able to find her, so he soon notified police about his missing niece. Unbeknownst to them, Elizabeth had actually gotten off her bus at around 7 p.m. that night, but she didn't get far. As she turned into her street, she was grabbed from behind and threatened with a gun. Elizabeth screamed, but as this was winter, and as it was winter in Victoria, which is bitterly cold, it was rainy, it was windy, the wind drowned out the sounds of her screams. She was told to be quiet and was led down her street, and her captor actually held her hand while making her walk, giving the several people who walked past the pair the impression that they were a couple. Elizabeth was taken to Lloyd Park Reserve, where she was brutally attacked, strangled, stabbed, and had her throat cut. And the killer even went as far as to stomp on her face, breaking several of her facial bones in the process. And after he had killed her, he dragged her to a culvert a short distance away. Even in death, she was not safe, as the killer slashed her across the torso in a weird crisscross kind of leaving my signature kind of way. And when she was found, she was naked from the waist up, though there was no evidence of sexual assault. Her body was found at 5 p.m. the day after she went missing, a mere 250 metres away from her home. Now, Elizabeth's murder didn't make sense to police or her family. She did not have an enemy in the world. She was well liked. Why would anyone want to kill her, and why would anyone want to kill her so violently? Police were absolutely baffled. They mounted a huge search for this girl's killer. They put up a mannequin at the bus stop where she got off, dressed in the exact same clothes Elizabeth was wearing the night she was murdered, in the hopes it would jog the memory of somebody. They door knocked. They questioned bus drivers. They questioned bus passengers and checked out every library in the vicinity for any clue that Elizabeth might have been there and if she was talking to anybody. And no clue could be found. But sadly, it wouldn't be too long before they were looking at another attack, but this time the girl actually managed to get away. On the night of July 8th, 1993, 41-year-old bank clerk Rosa Toth was making her way home from work on the bus, as she always did. She got off the bus at Seaforth Railway Station and made her way towards her home, taking her usual route along Railway Parade. Making her way past the toilet block, she noticed a man hanging around but didn't really think too much of it, and she didn't have a chance to cross the street or even quicken her pace because she was attacked from behind the moment she walked past him. She was dragged towards an unlit park where her attacker held a gun to her head. Now, Rosa quickly realised the gun was fake, and she absolutely fought for her life with the man who was determined to drag her to a nearby nature reserve, actually pulling clumps of her hair out in the process. She fought back, biting this man's fingers to the bone, and she did this more than once, and she managed to break free and she fled. She ran with torn clothing and no shoes to the nearby road and managed to wave down a passing car. The police were called, and a shaken Rosa was absolutely certain if she didn't fight back, she would have been murdered. Now, the police went and looked at the location of her attack and found absolutely no sign of her attacker. But while they were taking notes and getting a statement from Rosa, he'd already moved on, and he'd managed to sneak off into the darkness, and sadly he'd found a new victim. Later that night, new mother, 22-year-old Deborah Freem, who lived in Seaforth, left her 12-day-old son, a little boy she'd called Jake, with a male friend and popped down to the corner store to buy some milk. When she didn't return, her worried friend called her boyfriend, the police and local hospitals looking for her, but no one had seen her. Now, Debbie's boyfriend and her friend then drove around looking for her, but when they couldn't find her, they called into Frankston Police Station and reported her missing. Sadly, the young mother's body was found by a local farmer on the afternoon of Monday the 12th of July, and just like Elizabeth Stevens before her, she had been strangled, this time with a cord. She had been slashed, she had been stabbed, and she had had her throat cut, but she had also not been sexually assaulted. With the grim discovery of this came the sick realisation that the attempted abduction and murder of Rosa was not just some random attack. The Frankston area had a killer on the loose, and no woman was safe. There was no pattern, there was no similarity with these women that the police could seem to work out. So police were relentless in their efforts to find the killer, following up every lead, increasing patrol, setting up an Operation Reassurance Centre aimed to arm women with advice on how to defend themselves if attacked. Media gave daily updates and detailed reports on the police efforts to find their man, and women locked themselves up and would not leave the house at night. They certainly did not venture out alone at night. But sadly, none of this helped as the killer struck again, and this time it was a local schoolgirl who was murdered in the light of day. Natalie Russell was a much-loved daughter of Brian and Carmel Russell, and the 17-year-old was a bubbly, popular girl who had her whole life ahead of her, and it was said that she was interested in studying journalism. Now, Natalie normally rode her bike to and from school with her brother, but on the afternoon of Friday the 30th of July 1993, she was driven to school by her mum, and having gotten an early mark that day, she left school early and walked home on her own. She took her usual shortcut to her home in Frankston North via a fenced walkway between two golf courses, and when she hadn't returned home by 8 o'clock that night, after hours of her worried parents calling friends and searching for their daughter high and low, police were called and she was reported missing. Sadly, Natalie's body was found soon after in the bushes between the track that she used to walk home. Her murder was more brutal and violent than the ones before her, and she had been repeatedly stabbed in the face and had her throat cut to the point where she was nearly decapitated. Like the others, there were no signs of sexual assault. But Natalie's horrific death would be the one that helped finally bring hers and Debbie's and Elizabeth's killer to justice, for in his stabbing frenzy, he left a bit of himself on her. A piece of skin, possibly from a finger, was stuck on Natalie's neck, and it was this bit of skin and an observant postman that would finally bring this sadistic killer undone. On the afternoon of Natalie Russell's murder, a postman going about delivering mail noticed something out of the ordinary. He noticed a rusted-out yellow Toyota Corona without number plates parked near the track where Natalie was murdered. Now, the postman also noticed a man inside the car using binoculars. Now, of course, with what was going on in the area, this raised suspicions, and the postie stopped at a house to call the police. Now, this was before mobile phones, guys, so he had to go to someone's house to call to use a phone. And once this postman had done that, she noticed that the man was gone. He was out of the car. Police arrived, took rego details from the rego sticker on the car's windshield, door knocked a few houses and then had to leave because they had to go to another call out. Police arrived, took rego details from the rego sticker on the car's windshield, door knocked a few houses and then they had to leave and go out to another call out. Now, in a sad twist of fate, they missed Natalie's attack by only minutes. And after Natalie's murder, they ran the car rego through the system and realised that it actually matched the description of a car that they had received a report about. And the report also stated that a man was slumped in the front seat of the car as if to avoid being seen. Now, the same car had also been seen in the vicinity of where Debbie Freeman's body had been found. So realising this was too much of a coincidence to ignore, the police paid the car's registered owner a visit. And the owner of that vehicle was 21-year-old Paul Denyer. Now, we need a bit of a backstory on Paul before I go any further, and it is pretty bloody scary. So, listener discretion is advised. Now, Paul Charles Denyer was born in Sydney on the 14th of April 1972 to English immigrants Maureen and Anthony Denyer, who came to Australia in 1965. Paul was the third of 6 children, and of that 6, there was only one daughter. Now, the family grew up and went to school in Campbelltown, New South Wales, and Paul seemed to have grown out of his awkward stage as a kid and was described as normal. All that changed, though, when his dad got a new job in Victoria as the manager of a restaurant called The Steak Place in South Oakley, and the family had to move. Now, none of the children were happy about moving away from their school and their friends, and Paul struggled the most with his new environment, making it hard to make friends and being described as a loner. He was also overweight and had an obsession with his knife collection as well as his collection of clubs and slingshots. Now, Paul's dark side was displayed as early as the age of 10, where he reportedly stabbed the family kitten and hung it from the tree in the backyard. Later on, at his last known place of employment, he allegedly slaughtered and dismembered 2 goats in the factory yard next door. Now, Paul also racked up a string of charges from 13 to 15 that ranged from stealing a car, shoplifting, and most disturbingly, assault after he forced another boy to masturbate in front of some horrified children. It was around this time that he started to develop a pure hatred of women and a desire to kill them. He would later say he had the urge to kill since he was 14 and said, quote, "I've always wanted to kill, waiting for the right time, waiting for that silent alarm to trigger me off." In 1992, he began a relationship with a woman named Sharon Johnson, who he met whilst working at a supermarket called Safeway, a job he lost after he apparently knocked over a woman and child with some empty trolleys. Now, the couple moved into a flat together, and Paul, thanks to his combination of laziness and incompetence, could not hold down a job, which meant Sharon was the breadwinner. This setup meant that she was out at work a lot and Paul had a lot of free time on his hands. And it was around then that strange things started to happen around the block of flats where they lived. One tenant came home to find her flat broken into and her engagement photos slashed. Another reported a peeping Tom. But the most disturbing was what happened to a woman called Donna. Now, Donna was the sister of another tenant, Trisha, who Paul and Sharon were friendly with. Now, Donna lived with her partner Les and their new baby in a block of flats not too far from Paul. Now, arriving home one night with their new baby, Sharon and her partner Les were greeted with the brutal sight of Donna's beloved cat, Buffy, dead on the kitchen floor, disemboweled, and with a picture of a bikini-clad woman shoved on top of its little body. On the wall next to the TV were the words "Dead Don" written in blood, and the cat's entrails were scattered about the walls, which had all been sprayed with blood. And in amongst all this was another message that read, "Donna, you're dead." In the bathroom, the terrified couple discovered 2 of Buffy's kittens were also dead. Both their throats had been cut and they were lying in a baby's bath full of bloody water. Now, Donna absolutely refused to stay in that flat one more night, and I can't say I blame her. And when she left, Paul told her she was safe, and if the perpetrator was ever caught, he would take care of things. Needless to say, that perpetrator was never caught. Fast forward to 1993, and police now have Paul Denyer at the top of their suspect list and were determined to interview him. Detective Mick Hughes and Charlie Bazzina called into his house at around 4:30 p.m, but he wasn't home, so they left a card asking for him to call them as soon as he could. At around 5:15, they received a call from Sharon asking what it was all about. Detectives told her it was a mere routine inquiry and that everyone was being interviewed. Sharon told them that Paul was home and they were welcome to come over. The police were at Paul's doorstep within 10 minutes, and Paul himself answered the door, commenting on how many police were there just for a routine inquiry. He happily let them in though and explained that his car was out of rego, but he had a permit to drive it until he got it repaired to be registered. As Paul was explaining his whereabouts at the time of the murders, police noticed he had several cuts on his hand, and one cut was missing some skin. It was a pretty decent cut, the same kind of cut that could have left the skin on Natalie Russell's body when she was found. Although he admitted to being in the vicinity of the murders at the time, he denied any involvement and offered up pretty weak excuses for being at the scenes. He said, in regards to his car being spotted near where Natalie was murdered, he said that his car had broken down and he was waiting for Sharon to come pick him up. He also explained away the cuts and scratches on his hands as a result of simply working on his car. But the seasoned police weren't buying it, and they knew it was him. They just had to get him to confess. They took him to Frankston Police Station for questioning and interrogated him for hours, and Paul maintained his innocence for hours. And it was only in the wee hours on the 1st of August 1993, after being told that he would need to provide a sample of blood and hair, and that if he was the killer, it would match what had been found on the victims and what had been found at the crime scenes, that he finally confessed with one chilling sentence. Okay, I killed all 3 of them. Just before 4 a.m. on the 1st of August 1993, Paul Denyer confessed to the murders of Elizabeth Stevens, Debbie Freem and Natalie Russell. He also confessed to the attempted murder of Rosa Toth. What he told detectives so matter-of-factly and sometimes rather proudly chilled them to their core, with some fighting the urge to throw up as he confessed in graphic detail the violence and the sadistic brutality of each murder. And I will warn you guys, some of this is disturbing. It was disturbing to research. It was disturbing to read it, but it happened, and these are the killer's words. So I will say them, but I will give you a warning. This is graphic and it can be upsetting. So listener discretion is advised. On the murder of Elizabeth Stevens, he told them that around 7 p.m. on the bleak, rainy evening of June 11, 1993, Elizabeth Stevens got off a bus on Cranbourne Road, Langwarrin, to walk the short distance to her house. Paul was waiting, not for Elizabeth in particular. He was waiting for someone, anyone, just someone to kill. And sadly, Elizabeth just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Paul followed her along the street in the rain and grabbed her from behind, telling her that he had a gun and if she screamed or tried to run away, he would kill her. He told detectives that the gun he held in her back was in fact a piece of aluminium piping with a wooden handle. At gunpoint, Paul marched the terrified Elizabeth to nearby Lloyd Park. Paul said in part, quote, walked in a bit of bushland beside the main track in Lloyd Park, sat there, stood in the bushes for a while, just standing there, I suppose. I held the gun to the back of her neck, walked across the track over towards the other small sand hill or something. On the other side of the hill, she asked me if she could, go to the toilet, so to speak. So I respected her privacy. So I turned around and everything while she did it and everything. When she finished, we just walked down towards where the goalposts were and we turned right and headed towards the area where she was found. I got to that area there and I started choking her with my hands and she passed out after a while. The oxygen got cut off to her head and she just stopped. And then I pulled out the knife and stabbed her many times in the throat and she was still alive. And then she stood up and then we walked around and all that and just walking around a few steps. And then I threw her on the ground and stuck my foot over her neck to finish her off. Paul gave great detail of how he stabbed and strangled the terrified young girl and even went as far to imitate the death rattles Elizabeth was experiencing as her life left her body. He told detectives he dragged her body to the drain and went home. And when he was asked why he did this, he replied, just wanted to kill, just wanted to take a life because I felt my life had been taken many times. He then moved on to the attempted murder of Rosa Toth. He told detectives that he approached Rosa from behind after he had seen her walking near Seaford Station. He put a hand over her mouth and held his fake gun to her head with the other hand. But Rosa resisted. She put up a fight and she bit his finger to the bone. Now, Rosa and Paul wrestled and Rosa escaped from his grip and ran out into the middle of the road, but no passing cars would stop. Paul chased after her, grabbed her by her hair, screaming at her, "Shut up or I'll blow your fucking head off." And Rosa nodded in agreement, but managed to escape again. And this time she managed to flag down a passing car while Paul fled into the darkness. When asked what his intention with Rosa was, he replied coolly, "I was just going to drag her in the park and kill her. That's all." Paul said that as well as the fake gun, he was carrying one of his homemade knives with a razor-sharp aluminium blade in his sock. Now, while a terrified Rosa was making her way to the nearest police station to report her near miss, Paul went to the train station and jumped on the next train to Frankston, where he got off at Cannonook and walked over the railway station's overpass looking for another victim. And it was there he spotted Debbie Frame getting out of her car and walking into the corner store. Now, Paul said that while Debbie was in the milk bar, he opened the rear door of her car, let himself into the back and closed the door behind him. He said he crouched in the back seat and listened as she came back to the car and she got in and drove away. He said he waited for her to start up the car so no one would hear her scream. And he said, quote, "And she put it into gear and she went to do a U-turn. I startled her just as she was doing that and she kept going into the wall of the milk bar, which caused a dent in the bonnet. I told her to, shut up or I'll blow her head off and all that shit." He then told Debbie to drive in a certain direction, which would take him to a place that he knew he wouldn't be disturbed at. And he told her if she tried anything, he would, quote, "decorate her car with her brains." Now, it's also worth mentioning here that Paul must have been aware that she had a child because there was a baby's seat in the back seat of the car with him. If you noticed, he didn't care because he still went on to kill her, and he never even mentioned the possibility of a child during his confession. Now, he made Debbie stop by some trees and told her to get out of the car, producing a length of cord from his pocket. He said, quote, "I popped it over her eyes real quickly so she didn't see it because I was going to strangle her. But I didn't want her to see the cord first. I lifted the cord up and I said, 'Can you see this?' And she just put her hand up to grab it, to feel it. And when she did that, I just yanked on it real quickly around her neck. And then I was struggling with her for about 5 minutes." Now, Paul said he strangled Debbie until she started to pass out. Then it was then that he drew the knife from his sock and repeatedly stabbed her about the neck and the chest. When she fell limp at his feet, he stabbed her multiple times in the neck and once in the stomach. He also told detectives that as she lay there dying, he lifted up her top before stabbing her in the stomach again because he, quote, wanted to see just how big her boobs were. He also said that she made bubbling noises as she lay there dying, just like Elizabeth before her. Paul dragged Debbie's body into a group of trees and covered her with branches. He then took off in her car, dumping it near his flat, where he then called his girlfriend Sharon and told her he would pick her up from the train station after work. Unbelievably, worried that there might be some evidence in Debbie's car, Paul returned to the vehicle the next day where he left it and grabbed the carton of eggs, 2 cartons of milk, some chocolates and cigarettes that she had purchased from the corner shop before she died, as well as her purse, and took them home with him where he disposed of them, and he buried her purse near where he would later kill Natalie Russell. When asked why he did this, he responded with, quote, "Same reason why I killed Elizabeth Stevens. I just wanted to." Paul then moved on to the murder of 17-year-old Natalie Russell. Now, he said that he had planned the abduction spot earlier in the day with a pair of pliers, and he had cut 3 holes a few metres apart in the cyclone wire fence that ran between the bike track and the reserve. So you have the footpath, you have the reserve, and then you have the cyclone wire fence, and he's cut 3 man-sized holes in that, but you wouldn't actually see those holes until you were right on top of them. Each hole was big enough for him to fit him and his victim through and drag her into the cover of a tree-lined reserve. Now, at about 2:30 that afternoon, he drove back to the start of the bike track in Sky Road and waited for his victim to enter on foot. Now, his plan was to follow her, and as she approached one of the holes in the fence, he would grab her and drag her through that hole and into the reserve where they would be protected by trees. They would be out of sight. He was armed with a razor-sharp homemade knife and a leather strap, which he intended to use to strangle his victim. After about 20 minutes or so of waiting, he saw a girl in a blue school uniform come out of the road where John Paul College was and enter the bike track. He followed. Paul said, "I stuck about 10 yards behind her until I got to the second hole. And just when I got to that hole, I quickly walked up behind her and stuck my left hand around her mouth and held my knife to her throat. And that's where that cut happened, the cut on his thumb." And Paul actually indicated the cut on his thumb and the piece of missing skin. He went on to say that he cut that with his own blade. Now, Paul said that Natalie was struggling at first when he grabbed her, but stopped when he told her that if she didn't stop, he would cut her throat. The terrified Natalie offered Denius sex, which disgusted him as he clearly failed to see that Natalie must have realised she was in the hands of the Frankston serial killer, and you know, the poor girl would have done anything to save her life, even if it meant having sex with him. Now, Paul went on to say, she said, you can have all my money, have sex with me, and things, just disgusting things like that, really. And Paul was visibly repulsed recalling this fact. The fact that this poor schoolgirl offered up herself to save her life absolutely repulsed him. Not undeterred, Paul forced Natalie to kneel in front of him and held the point of the knife very close to her eye. He then forced her to lie on the ground and knelt over her, holding her by the throat and still holding the point of the knife over her eye. When she struggled, he cut her across the face, and she still somehow managed to stand up and started to scream. Paul said, I just said, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up. And if you don't shut up, I'll kill you. If you don't do this, I'll kill you. If you don't do that. And she said, what do you want from me? And I said, all I want you to do is shut up. And so when she was kneeling on the ground, I put the strap around her neck to strangle her, and it broke in half. And then she started violently struggling for about a minute until I pushed her onto her back again, and I pushed her head back and I cut her throat. Paul went on to describe how he put his actual fingers in the cut in Natalie's throat and squeezed her cords, even twisting them. He demonstrated to horrified police how he actually stuck his fingers in Natalie's neck, in the cut in her neck, up to his knuckles. When asked why he did that by horrified detectives, he told them to stop her from breathing. He then said that when she went weak, he threw her head back and cut her throat, almost decapitating her. When asked why he killed her, he replied, quote, just same reason as before, just everything came back through my mind again. I kicked her before I left. Paul also said he slashed her face with his knife before he left, and he was walking back to his car with blood-soaked hands hidden in his pockets when he saw two police officers checking out his car. He simply turned around and went the other way, and the police never saw him. Once home, he washed his clothes, hid the murder weapon in his backyard, and spent a quiet night at his mum's with his girlfriend Sharon, both of them none the wiser. It's worth mentioning here too that the only real flare of emotion Paul showed while confessing to these three murders was when he recounted that Natalie had offered to have sex with him to save her life. He was repulsed. There was nothing else, just the absolute repulsiveness that gave him. Okay, now remember Donna. Remember the poor woman who come home to find her cat and kittens killed and blood and threats written all over her wall. Yep, that was Paul. He confessed to that as well. And he also confessed that he had gone to Donna's house that night with the sole purpose of killing her. But when he got there, she wasn't home. So the poor cats copped it instead. He also said that he'd been stalking women for years and, quote, was just waiting for the right time, waiting for that silent alarm to trigger me off, waiting for the sign. And when detectives questioned him further about his hatred for women, he stated simply, I just hate them. When questioned as to why he never hurt Sharon, which, you're living with an absolute psycho, I would be wanting to know why he hadn't hurt me. He simply said that him and Sharon, they were kindred spirits, and she was not like anyone else that he knew, and he would never hurt her. Paul Daniel was charged with murder of all three women and stood trial on December 15th, 1993, where he pled guilty. The court heard from a clinical psychologist that said Paul showed absolutely no remorse for his actions and seemed to enjoy recounting the murders. Paul tried to blame a few things for him being the way he was, such as a hard upbringing, alleged sexual abuse by his older brother, and I'll get to that in a bit, and habitual unemployment. But psychologist Dr. Ian Joblin wasn't having any of it, and he went on to say he found intentional maltreatment of victims intensely gratifying, taking pleasure in torment, anguish, distress, hopelessness, and suffering of the victim. In contrast to simple anger, the behaviour of a sadistic personality is fully premeditated. He is not suddenly exploding with rage. The more aggressive he became, the more powerful he felt. Paul's excuses were also rejected by Dr. Joblin, and Dr. Joblin stated simply, and rightly so, that lots of us live under similar circumstances and we've had similar upbringings, and we don't go out and commit murder. Now, Dr. Joblin was of the opinion that Paul had a sadistic personality and was not insane. He knew what he was doing. He said there was absolutely no treatment for Paul and no guarantee he wouldn't kill again if given the chance. On the 20th of December 1993, Paul Charles Denyer was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences with a fixed non-parole period. In his sentencing, Justice Vincent said, quote, "The apprehension you have caused to thousands of women in the community will be felt for a long time. For many, you are the fear that quickens their step as they walk home or causes a parent to look anxiously at the clock when a child is late." Now, Paul appealed his sentence and it was heard in 1994, and he was granted a minimum sentence of 30 years. That's only 10 years for the life of each woman he killed, with the sentence ending in 2023, much to the absolute disgust and distress of his victims' families. Now, to add insult to injury, 10 years into his sentence, Paul decided that he identified as a woman and was to be known as Paula. He demanded gender reaffirming surgery, which was denied by the state. Now, during this time, he sent several letters, which have now been published, and I've included these letters in the episode description. I've included the link to these letters in the episode description. And in one letter, he states, "What more can a girl take?" Now, families of his victims said it was sick and it was a publicity stunt. And in 2023, when his 30 years jail time was up, he applied for parole and was denied. And the Victorian government quickly rushed through new laws to restrict parole for serious offenders like Paul. So Paul Denyer will stay behind bars for the rest of his natural life. But being locked up didn't stop Paul from putting fear into his estranged brother and sister-in-law. Now, these guys fled to the UK after Paul apparently threatened to kill his sister-in-law and family in a shopping centre before the murders took place. But anyway, before the murders took place, and these guys were horrified when a letter landed in their letterbox from Paul himself. Somehow Paul had managed to track his brother down in the Tesco store where he worked, and he'd even written Paul Denyer as the sender of the envelope. Now, the letter absolutely shocked them to their core about how could he possibly find where I am, and it pissed off Paul's victims' families no end in Australia, with them questioning how he had managed to find the address of his brother from a maximum security jail and how he managed to get that letter out to him. How on earth does that happen? Now, this, of course, meant the system was looked into and things were changed. At the time, Paul's letters were simply scanned but not read. Now they are. And I was not able to find how he managed to find his brother's address in the UK to send him a letter. I haven't been able to find how that happened. At the time of this podcast, Paul is now identifying as Paul. He's no longer identifying as a woman. He's gone back to identifying as Paul. And like I said before, he will serve the rest of his natural life in jail, and really that's letting him off lightly. So there we have it, listeners, the story of 3 beautiful young women who had their whole lives ahead of them. One was a young mum, one was a schoolgirl, and one was studying for her dream job, and all tragically, brutally cut short by a man so evil, so horrible, so unimaginable that he just deserves no further mention. Instead, let's focus on the women, their lives and their families who continue to fight today for justice and to keep their precious girls' memories alive. It's worth mentioning that the track that Natalie was killed on has been named Nat's Track and is enjoyed by families and their kids riding their bikes and their skateboards and their little trikes regularly on a regular basis, like on weekends and after school. And this is something that Natalie's parents are immensely proud of. I hope they know the difference they are making to the victims of crime in Australia, and I hope they know how appreciated their voices and their efforts are. I really do. I don't know how you could ever move on from losing somebody in such a horrible way and to such a monster, but I do hope they are able to find a bit of happiness in each day. They absolutely deserve that and nothing less. So there we have it, guys. Another episode of Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans, True Aussie Murders Caffeinated, done and dusted. Thank you for lending me your ears. And if you are enjoying these podcasts, please hit like, hit share, hit comment. I am slowly getting onto the promotion social media thing. I do have TikTok. If anyone's on TikTok and they want to give me a follow, please check it out. And I'm not sure if you can comment yet on Spotify. I'm not sure if we can do that here in Australia. It seems to be blocked, but anyway. And, you know, if you are enjoying these podcasts, please get the word out. Shout out to your friends. If you have any true crime friends, any true crime junkies, I'm your girl. You know, shout it fast, shout it wide, tell everybody. And as always, guys, thank you for listening. I absolutely appreciate it. You are all absolute rock stars. And until next time, guys, please stay safe, stay cool, and stay caffeinated. And I will catch you all later.